Hello and welcome to today's episode of The Jungle. Today we're going to read pages 82 to 88. Now the dreadful winter was come upon them. In the forests of Lithuania, all summer long, the branches of the trees do battle for light, and some of them lose and die. And then come the raging blasts and the storms of snow and hail, and strew the ground with these weaker branches. Just so it was in Packingtown. The whole district braced itself for the struggle that was an agony, and those whose time was come died off in hordes. All the year round they'd been serving as cogs in the great packing machine, and now was a time for the renovating of it and the replacing of damaged parts. There came pneumonia and grippe, stalking among them, seeking for weakened constitutions. There was the annual harvest of those whom tuberculosis had been dragging down. There came cruel, cold, and biting winds, and blizzards of snow, all testing relentlessly for failing muscles and impoverished blood. Sooner or later came the day when the unfit one did not report for work. And then, with no time lost in waiting, and no inquiries or regrets, there was a chance for a new hand. The new hands were here by the thousands. All day long the gates of the packing houses were besieged by starving and penniless men. They came, literally, by the thousands every single morning, fighting with each other for a chance for life. Blizzards and cold made no difference to them, for they were always on hand. They were on hand 2 hours before the sun rose, an hour before the work began. Sometimes their faces froze. Sometimes their feet and their hands. Sometimes they froze altogether, but still they came. For there was no other place to go. One day Durham advertised in the newspaper for 200 men to cut ice, and all that day the homeless and starving of the city came trudging through the snow from all over its 200 square miles. That night, 40 score of them crowded into the station house of the Stockyards district. They filled the rooms, sleeping in each other's laps, toboggan fashion, and they piled on top of each other in the corridors, till the police shut the doors, and left some to freeze outside. On the morrow, before daybreak, there were 3,000 at Durham's, and the police reserves had to be sent for to quell the riot. Then, Durham's bosses picked out 20 of the biggest. It turned out that 200 was a printing error. 4 or 5 miles eastward to the lake what lake are we talking about? Lake Michigan. So right off the coast of Chicago, we're talking about one of the Great Lakes, Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan is so large that it actually qualifies as an inland sea. 4 or 5 miles to the eastward lay the lake, and over this the bitter winds came raging. Sometimes the thermometer would fall to 10 or 20 degrees below zero at night, and in the morning the streets would be piled with the snowdrifts up to the first floor windows. The streets through which our friends had to go to their work were all unpaved and full of deep holes and gullies. In summer, when it rained hard, a man might have to wade to his waist to get home. And now, in winter, it was no joke getting through these places before light in the morning and after dark at night. They would wrap up in all they owned, but they could not wrap up against exhaustion. And many a man gave out in these battles with the snowdrifts and lay down and fell asleep. And if it was bad for the men, one may imagine how the women and children fared. Some would ride in the streetcars, if the cars were running, but when you only make 5 cents an hour, as was little Stanislaus, you do not like to spend that much to ride 2 miles. The children would come to the yards with great shawls about their ears, and so tied up that you could hardly find them. And still, there would be accidents. One bitter morning in February, the little boy who worked at the lard machine with Stanislaus came about an hour late, and screaming with pain. They unwrapped him, and a man began vigorously rubbing his ears, and as they were frozen stiff, it took only 2 or 3 rubs to break them off. As a result of this, little Stanislaus conceived a terror of the cold that was almost a mania. Every morning when it was time to start for the yards, he would begin to cry and protest. Nobody knew quite how to manage him, for threats did no good. It seemed to be something that he could not control, and they feared sometimes that he would go into convulsions. In the end, it had to be arranged that he always went with Jurgis, and came home with him again, and often, when the snow was deep, the man would carry him the whole way on his shoulders. Sometimes Jurgis would be working until late at night, and then it was pitiful, for there was no place for the little fellow to wait, save in the doorways, or in a corner of the killing beds, and he would all but fall asleep there and freeze to death. There was no heat upon the killing beds. The men might exactly as well worked out of doors all winter. For that matter, there was very little heat anywhere in the building, except in the cooking rooms and such places, and it was the men who worked in these who ran the most risk of all, because whenever they had to pass to another room, they had to go through ice-cold corridors, and sometimes with nothing on above the waist except a sleeveless undershirt. On the killing beds, you were apt to be covered with blood, and it would freeze solid. If you leaned against a pillar, you would freeze to that. And if you put your hand upon the blade of your knife, you ran a chance of leaving your skin on it. The men would tie up their feet in newspapers and old sacks, and these would be soaked in blood and frozen, and then soaked again, and so on, until by nighttime a man would be walking on great lumps the size of the feet of an elephant. Now and then, when the bosses were not looking, you would see them plunging their feet and ankles into the steaming hot carcass of the steer, or darting across the room to the hot water jets. The cruelest thing of all was that nearly all of them, all of those who used knives, were unable to wear gloves, and their arms would be white with frost, and their hands would grow numb, and then, of course, there would be accidents. Also, the air would be full of steam from the hot water and the hot blood, so that you could not see 5 feet before you. And then, with the men rushing about at the speed they kept up on the killing beds, and all with butcher knives, like razors in their hands, well, it was to be counted a wonder that there were not more men slaughtered than cattle. And yet, all of this inconvenience they might have put up with, if only it had not been for one thing. If only there had been some place where they might eat. Jurgis had either to eat his dinner amid the stench in which he had worked, there on the killing beds, or else to rush, as did all of his companions, to any one of the hundreds of liquor stores which stretched out their arms to him. To the west of the yards ran Ashland Avenue, and here was an unbroken line of saloons. Whiskey Row, they called it. To the north was 47th Street, where there were half a dozen to the block, and at the angle of the two was Whiskey Point, a space of 15 or 20 acres, and containing one glue factory and about 200 saloons. One might walk among these and take his choice. Hot pea soup and boiled cabbage today. Sauerkraut and hot frankfurters. Walk in. Bean soup and stewed lamb. Welcome. All of these things were printed in many languages, as were also the names of the resorts, which were infinite in their variety and appeal. There was the home circle and the cozy corner. There were firesides and hearthstones and pleasure palaces and wonderlands and dream castles and love's delights. Whatever else they were sure to be called Union Headquarters, and to hold out a welcome to working men. And there was always a warm stove and a chair near it and some friends to laugh and talk with. There was only one condition attached. You must drink. If you went in not intending to drink, you would be put out in no time. And if you were slow about going, like as not, you would get your head split open with a beer bottle in the bargain. But all of the men understood the convention and drank. They believed that by it they were getting something for nothing, for they did not need to take more than one drink, and upon the strength of it they might fill themselves up with a good hot dinner. This did not always work out in practice, however, for there was pretty sure to be a friend who would treat you, and then you would have to treat him, then someone else would come in, and anyway, a few drinks were good for a man who worked hard. As he went back, he did not shiver so. He had more courage for his task. The deadly, brutalizing monotony of it did not afflict him so. He had ideas while he worked, and took a more cheerful view of his circumstances. On the way home, however, the shivering was apt to come on him again, and so he would have to stop once or twice to warm up against the cruel cold. As there were hot things to eat in this saloon, too, he might get home late to his supper, or he might not get home at all. And then his wife might set out to look for him, and she too would feel the cold, and perhaps she would have some of the children with her. And so a whole family would drift into drinking, as the current of a river drifts downstream. As if to complete the chain, the packers all paid their men in checks, refusing all requests to pay in coin. And where in Packingtown could a man go to have his check cashed but to a saloon, where he could pay for the favor by spending part of the money? Okay, so we've talked about this circumstance before when we talked about Prohibition. Prohibition doesn't come about until 1920, but this is the lead up to it. In the 20, 30, 40 years before Prohibition, alcoholism was becoming such an enormous problem to the very fabric of who we were as a United States that there was a lot of concern that we could not continue to be a country with families falling apart, and the very structure of the country falling apart to alcoholism like this. From all of these things, Jurgis was saved because of Ona. He would never take but the one drink at noontime, and so he got the reputation of being a surly fellow, and was not quite welcome at the saloons, and had to drift about from one to another. Then at night he would go straight home, helping Ona and Stanislaus, or often putting the former on a car, and when he got home, perhaps he would have to trudge several blocks, and come staggering back through the snowdrifts with a bag of coal upon his shoulder. Home was not a very attractive place, at least not this winter. They had only been able to buy one stove, a wood-burning stove to heat the place, and this was a small one, and proved not big enough to warm even the kitchen in the bitterest weather. This made it hard for Teta Elzbieta all day, and for the children when they could not get to school. At night, they would sit huddled round this stove while they ate their supper off their laps, and then Jurgis and Jonas would smoke a pipe, after which they would all crawl into their beds to get warm after putting out the fire to save the coal. Then they would have some frightful experience with the cold. They would sleep with all of their clothes on, including their overcoats, and put over them all the bedding and spare clothing they owned. The children would sleep all crowded into one bed, and yet, even so, they could not keep warm. The outside ones would be shivering and sobbing, crawling over the others and trying to get down into the center and causing a fight. This old house with the leaky weatherboards was a very different thing from their cabins at home, with great thick walls plastered inside and outside with mud, and the cold which came upon them was a living thing, a demon presence in the room. They would wake it in the midnight hours when everything was black. Perhaps they would hear it yelling outside, or perhaps there would be death-like stillness. And that would be worse yet. They could feel the cold as it crept in through the cracks, reaching out for them with its icy, death-dealing fingers. And they would crouch and cower and try to hide from it. All in vain. It would come, and it would come. A grisly thing, a specter born in the black caverns of terror, a power primeval, cosmic, shadowing the tortures of the lost souls flung out to chaos and destruction. It was cruel, iron hard, and hour after hour they would cringe in its grasp, alone. There would be no one to hear them if they cried out. There would be no help. No mercy, and so on until morning, when they would go out to another day of toil, a little weaker, a little nearer to the time when it would be their turn to be shaken from the tree.